So hi and welcome back everyone. I hope you had a good break and you used it to visit the virtual exhibition and connect and interact with the other participants. My name is Kristina Rauland-Yambre. I work with the German development agency GIZ, and I have the pleasure of moderating this keynote session together with my colleague Rike Riesmeier. It's truly wonderful to see so many of you gathered here to exchange ideas on large-scale food fortification in West Africa, to learn from each other, to share your work, to connect and to collaborate. We are especially honored to kick off this event with two highly respected experts in the field of nutrition and food fortification. They will help us set the tone for the next 2 days of discussion, learning and innovation. Please join us welcoming Mr. Sean Baker, Chief Program Officer at Helen Keller International, and Mr. Francis Aminu, Director for Health and Nutrition at the Aliko Dangote Foundation. I'm sure their keynote speeches will spark ideas, provoke thoughts, and inspire action. And we'll follow them with a 45 minutes Q&A and discussion session. So please jot down your questions and feel free to share them in the chat. Let me start by introducing Sean Baker. Sean is the Chief Program Officer at Helen Keller International, where he leads efforts to strengthen food and health systems in some of the world's most vulnerable communities, using solutions that are evidence-based, scalable, and equitable. He previously served as the first chief nutritionist at USAID and was the first director of nutrition at the Gates Foundation. Over a career spanning more than 35 years, including 3 decades in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, Sean has shaped major global nutrition efforts, from leading roles in the Sun Movement to chairing the Global Fund's Technical Review Panel. He currently chairs the Micronutrient Forum and co-leads the Independent Expert Group on Nutrition for the 2025 Nutrition for Growth Summit. Sean holds degrees in public health and biology and is based in Dakar, Senegal. Sean Baker, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Kristina, for that kind introduction. Thank you to you and Rike for your personal leadership on large-scale food fortification and other aspects of nutrition, and to GIZ's commitment. And really thanks also to Catholic Relief Services who've put this together. And it's just so fun to be with colleagues with whom we've been working for decades, including the leadership of the West African Health Organization, the Economic Commission of West African States, and the UMOA Commission, and of course, the Industrial Association of Cooking Oil Producers, AIFO-CEDEAO. I think many of us know this, but I think it's always useful to go back to why we are so engaged, so passionate about large-scale food fortification. Others have referred to some of these numbers, but I just want to refresh. Globally, 1.2 billion women of reproductive age and 372 million young children suffer deficiency in at least one essential nutrient. Those numbers are grim, and without action, they're likely to get worse because there are many headwinds against us. We're all living through an era of increased food prices. The populations we care most about, who are the most vulnerable, any increase in food prices means they cannot afford more nutritious foods, and they have to double down on staples to fill bellies. So that immediately creates a worse nutrition gap. There are also growing conflicts, and we know that conflicts undermine families' ability both to grow food and to purchase food, and particularly nutritious food in both cases. And perhaps the most existential is the climate crisis, which of course completely disrupts food systems. And there's growing evidence that warmer temperatures also, in fact, decrease the nutrient content in the very foods that are being grown. And behind each and every one of those numbers are real people. And I wanted to hone in on the example of just one nutrient, a particularly powerful nutrient, folate, folic acid, or B9. It's essential in the development of the neural tube, so the spinal cord, the spine, the brain. And The development of the spinal cord happens very, very early in pregnancy, before almost any woman is aware she's pregnant and goes to prenatal services in the first, third, or fourth week of pregnancy. During that very short window, things can go really right, or they can go horribly, horribly wrong. And globally, the best estimates are that over 260,000 births each year are affected by neural tube defects. 75% of those children die. It's even worse because it's such a horrific condition that there are at least 58,000 stillbirths because the neural tube defect was so severe that the fetus did not survive. And another 59,000 cases where the neural tube defect is detected early in pregnancy, and parents make that horrifically difficult decision to end the pregnancy. So we just think of the magnitude of the impacts of the deficiency in just one nutrient that is devastating for hundreds of thousands of lives each year. And this is not talking about all the other super nutrients that we put into fortified foods, including vitamin A, iron, zinc, etc. I have the pleasure, as you said, Kristina, of living back here in Dakar, Senegal, where I've lived now for over a decade. And every time I go to a market and I see on cooking oil or wheat flour an enrichi logo, which means fortified in French, I just get a smile on my face. And if you ask my kids or my grandchildren, they will say just how much I systematically pointed out to them. Because this is really a concrete sign of Senegal's leadership, which mandated fortification of these two essential staples back in 2010. But it's also a concrete example of the incredible capital of leadership and experience across West Africa. It actually dates back even further, because in 1992, there was a resolution across all 15 countries of the Economic Community of West African States for fortification of salt with iodine, or salt iodization. In 2002, under the leadership of the just newly formed West African Health Organization, there was the first ever private-public sector dialogue on large-scale food fortification in West Africa. And among the colleagues, among the organizations that supported that were UNICEF, the World Health Organization, the Micronutrient Initiative, which is now called Nutrition International, and we at Helen Keller International are very proud to join that. And that really launched this incredible journey of fortification across West Africa, both at the country level and regionally. And I think that the Director General of the West African Health Organization earlier today, the representative of AIFO-CEDEAO, and others have given a lot of the detail of that tremendous journey of fortifying West Africa. And I take away from that West Africa has huge progress in large-scale food fortification, and there's an immense capital of goodwill, expertise, and experience of how fortification can work. But I also think we can do even better. As I'd said, we are still not meeting the needs of all moms and kids across West Africa, and there are headwinds against us. So there's a certain urgency to build on this success and do even better. And I boil it down to 3 opportunity gaps and 3 key levers. On the opportunity gaps, I think of it in terms of the performance gap, the design gap, and the food technology gap. And let me build out each of those. On the performance gaps, all countries across the West Africa region do have fortification standards on the books. Unfortunately, not all industries, and certainly not all imports, are meeting those standards. So the first order of business is to support industries to make sure they're able to meet the standards that are on the books, and ensure that any foods imported under the food fortification mandate are meeting those standards. Because without ensuring good performance, nothing else really will work. On the design gap side, many of these standards were developed a long time ago, and evidence has changed. Evidence local evidence on what are the consumption patterns of different food vehicles, and then some of the global evidence on what are the best fortificants, the most effective fortificants to put into foods. So it's important to go back to the basics and say, okay, are we fortifying the right foods at the right levels of the right fortificants to optimize impact? I also think that underscores that perhaps in the past we saw these fortification standards almost as holy scripture. You never touch them again. But I think where we need to, going forward, be more nimble of having structures that routinely look at standards to say, are they up to date given the context and given the global evidence base? The third gap I see is what I call the food technology gap. I think in large-scale food fortification, sometimes we've been complacent of putting the usual nutrient suspects into the usual fortification vehicles, and not all populations are having access to the vehicles. And so there remain gaps, but opportunities to look, are there other food vehicles we can either add nutrients to or in fact, bring on new fortification vehicles. And there are a couple of examples that are really exciting that I know of in Ethiopia, where there's a huge burden of neural tube defects, and not a lot of populations don't yet have access to fortified wheat flour. There's a big push to fortify salt also with B9 or folic acid. Already fortified with iodine, it can also carry another nutrient. And here in West Africa, there's some exciting work on looking at bouillon cubes, which are used by every household across the region. And how can you add multiple nutrients into these essential condiments that are used in every household? None of this is to replace the usual vehicles, but really to complement and build out a basket of fortified foods. Then I think there are three essential levers we really need to double down on: data, coordination, and accountability. Data, but really data that's going to drive action and impact. Our data on background deficiencies, aside from a couple of countries in the region, is really quite outdated. We often don't have updated data on food consumption patterns, which is essential to understand what people are eating at what levels, and then what levels of nutrients we should be putting into food vehicles. And we certainly it's essential to have routine data on the actual compliance. Are these foods being fortified to standards? And if not, what are the bottlenecks and how do we correct it? And others have also alluded to the incredible importance of coordination, because food fortification does require a number of sectors and a number of stakeholders, each playing their role. And for those of you who love music, you probably understand that the difference between cacophony and music is really having a concert master that's keeping all the actors playing and singing from the same hymn book and not just going out in different directions. And so that effective coordination that's really focused on problem solving and celebrating success at the national and regional level is incredibly important. And lastly, how do we have better accountability? And this is where I think we've not yet solved that in the region. We have many people who are dedicated to this, but all of us, be it government, non-government organizations like my own, donors, we all need to be held accountable for our promises. And who's going to do it? Is there a way to better engage civil society organizations, better engage professional organizations, better engage academia? So there's a constant voice from the outside saying, look, you need to keep foods fortified. We cannot let people who are the most vulnerable to micronutrient malnutrition suffer from these deficiencies, which are completely solvable. I was going to close with a quote from our founder, Helen Keller, who said, among other things, "Alone we can do so little, together we can do so much." And I think that's very apt for large-scale food fortification, where each of us working in silos is not going to solve the problem. And I am really convinced that with the capital of experience and expertise that we have in West Africa, together, we really are positioned to eliminate the scourge of deficiencies in essential vitamins and minerals. Thank you very much.
Kristina, your mic is on mute. I don't know if you're talking.
Yes, sorry, I have been. Okay, I was saying, thank you. Thank you so much, Sean, for that powerful and insightful keynote. You've reminded us how far West Africa has come in the journey of large-scale food fortification and rightly celebrated the achievements driven by strong national and regional leadership. At the same time, you made it clear that our work is far from being done. In a time when more and more families struggle to afford nutritious diets, tackling vitamin and mineral deficiencies is not only urgent, it's essential. And you've given us a roadmap forward, grounded in better data, stronger coordination, and meaningful accountability. These are the levers we must pull to translate commitment into impact. Thank you again, Sean, for setting the stage with such clarity and purpose. Let me now introduce Mr. Francis Aminu. Francis is Director for Health and Nutrition at the Aliko Dangote Foundation in Nigeria, where he leads strategic initiatives that link health and nutrition with education, economic empowerment, and humanitarian work. Before joining the foundation, Francis held leadership roles at GAIN, Nutrition International, and USAID-funded programs. With deep experience in scaling nutrition interventions in Nigeria, he has played a key role in shaping national policy and implementation. He holds a PhD in human nutrition, a postgraduate diploma in public administration, and is a fellow of several leading public health and nutrition bodies in Nigeria. Francis Aminu, the stage is yours, and I'm just sharing your presentation for you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kristina. And thank you so much, Sean. The little height of might you are seeing is because I've been able to stand on the shoulders of people like Sean. When we were still studying what food is, Sean was already all over the scape, trying to see how best this could be applied. So we met something that we could read from people like him and a host of other of my senior colleagues that are here at this fair from all walks of life. It's a pleasure meeting you once again. And without wasting much of your time, I just want to ride on what Sean has said. He has actually encapsulated everything that you can refer to as one way or the other. I may repeat one or two things, but maybe with emphasis or just a kind of an addition that I would like to add to that. And in lieu of that, I would like to, maybe at a time I may create for indulgence to remove my video because my internet here is very, very poor. It may not allow me to deliver effectively if I don't remove that. So please, I create your indulgence that I have to remove my video so that I can maximize the impact of the internet service I have around here. Thank you. Yes, like I said, and like what is an effective way of actually, as he rightly pointed out. And a 2019 review attempted to estimate that, which he mentioned, particularly with regard to how food fortification, especially on large scale, and when they are well done at a kind of population-wide level, they are already associated with impact on health outcomes, such as goiter, anemia, and neurotubular defects prevalence that he rightly mentioned. So I just want to emphasize that. So the next slide, rather, I would like to look at the status of compliance in West Africa. I mean, all the countries that are very close in West African side. When you look at that, the impact of National Food Fortification Program is contingent on the extent to which there is compliance with national standards. And that is it. And food fortification program, like John mentioned too, have made progress, tremendous one, because some of us saw the beginning, especially in countries like Nigeria, and then we participated even within the region. We saw how countries started and then are making headway. However, we still have some some not meeting up, but again, that's what we are looking at critically. We are not apportioning blame here, but it's just a kind of another way of calling ourselves together to say where exactly, and Sean has already given us a lot of gaps, those three key recommendations. And I think with that approach, to date, virtually all the countries in West Africa, next slide, please. All the countries in West Africa, they've passed mandatory fortification legislation, you know, especially for wheat flour, for vegetable oil, and salt. All the countries at one time or the other, but it's only Liberia and Nigeria that have actually passed for sugar. And rice, we don't have yet because it's just an evolving kind of initiative from one country to the other, even at the regional level. But the question we ask ourselves is, after mandatory fortification legislation and standards are passed, how do we know whether food is actually being fortified? So, and that's why we have to go to that extent. Ideally, the proportion of food that is fortified should be assessed by the government entity that's responsible for food control. I'm referring to the regulatory bodies, you know, so that they can be monitoring the regulations that they've set in terms of how all those inputs into the industrial product eventually becomes fortified. And then this may include activities such as an audit or qualitative or quantitative test of samples, which they carried out. And when adherence to fortification is assessed by any authority or authorized government agency, either at the point of production and or the point of import, then this is considered compliance data that we need to collect. And these data are collected at various levels and by various sectors. What then happens? Just to have even progress with those data that we're talking about, the next slide. You know, when you look at, in terms of extent to which those food has been able to deliver vitamin and minerals to the general population, if you look at iodine in salt, you know, that has seen a significant improvement. There's no doubt about that, with countries still achieving almost food compliance. And then the same with vitamin A, where it's fortified with sugar in some instances, margarine, cooking oil, and wheat flour in some cases with vitamin A. That has improved. However, some countries still struggle with supply chain issues and micronutrient stability, leading to reduced compliance in that regard. And when you look at iron and folic acid, compliance with iron fortification in wheat flour has shown improvement too. But just like what Sean said, further progress is still needed to reach full compliance when it comes to that. The same with folic acid fortification in wheat flour. Like he rightly mentioned, specifically for Ethiopia, yeah, there are still some. Full compliance still remains a target that we all need to look at. And the same with other micronutrients that we have out there that have been added to those foods. The next slide. Here, I just want to show to us the status, how those countries are really fearing. I mean, how all of us collectively, because I don't want to point out any country. I refuse to mention a particular country. But when you look at all the countries that is fortified in the country, items are being implemented by food producers and monitored by food control systems. However, availability of these data are sparse. We hardly can get data from some countries, which we'll see later, suggesting that few countries monitor for food fortification, despite their mandatory legislation, which we have had. However, when you look at each of the vehicles, wheat flour, 11 out of about 16 countries have data that indicates regulatory monitoring and enforcement as in practice. And when you look at all those countries we're talking about, only 7 have compliance levels that are above 80%. The same with maize flour. Only Nigeria has data that indicates regulatory monitoring and enforcement is in practice. And then interestingly enough, that's about 80% of compliance by the current data in the global food fortification data exchange. The same with salt. Salt, out of 16 countries, only 4 countries have data that indicates regulatory monitoring and enforcement is in practice. And of those countries, only 2 have compliance level above 80. And then vegetable oil, 4 out of 16 countries have data that indicates regulatory monitoring and enforcement is in practice. But of those 4 countries, none has a compliance level that is above 80. In fact, the highest is from Nigeria. But again, like I said, responsible or more responsible or most responsible out of various stakeholders. But we have to look at it from the point of view of food fortification value chain, which will take us to this slide. And when you look at it, we have areas of industries, we have importers, we have micronutrient premises plays a role. And when you look at that value chain, the industry has started its program for what he aimed or wanted to achieve, and then set up his industry to achieve that. Then the to it to get it this way. And then which is that fortification process, where a lot of things have to, you have to determine a lot of things. Means where to find the premise and what quantity will the whole value chain until you get to even, I'm referring to the production, branding, and distribution of those. These are the roles. That's where the industry, at the end of the day, whatever happens, I know most cases, some in regulatory monitoring, the industry will say they don't. And as a result, they are not responsible. The value chain takes it up to the table where consumers will have access to this. That compliance goes beyond just adding those. This is a product you conceived, you wanted to give a value chain, and you have added. I still feel that's the responsibility of such private sector to be able to do that. And a case carried out by TechnoSec, which I participated in terms of how we brought the leadership of the industry the fortification performance of their great project that actually build their capacity, responsive technical assistance provided for them, and in such a way that they take in terms of what they're able to add, what we call self-assessment, which is the core of the micronutrient fortification index. Inputs along the value chain. In terms, you have the actors like the micronutrient producers and suppliers. You have other things you need to do, your production of the product, then the procurement will all affect the quality of product you are doling out. And it doesn't end there, such that supporter, technical supporter of the fact group to validate indirectly. And then with the testing from the regulatory body, when you combine that, you now recognize, and in that regard. So I think it's really a program that has strengthened the ability of processors to comply with fortification standards. Lastly, I just want to mention, yes, we have a great opportunity here, especially the food industry. Impact in terms of what we must understand and follow the existing country regulations for food fortification. I know we are aiming for the regional kind. But at the same time, because of peculiarity, we do that. Then we need to follow best practices for quality control and assurance, in terms of what we do, which is and the backbone of any product that we have is very, very important. Then, because we have been involved, again, like I said earlier on, we were invited. National process to develop standards, started the product before fortification came on board. Then we need to all jointly, I listened to UMO president. The problem will not wait for us, it's a change in the region. And I think private sector should look at it from that point of view of their contribution and their role. Thank you so much for the opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Francis, for your valuable insights and for grounding your remarks on both evidence and experience. Unfortunately, you have been interrupted quite some long sentences. So what I would like to suggest is maybe you could try and improve a bit your connection, and during the Q&A session, we can come back to some points. In the meantime, I can try and resume a bit. So you have reinforced the critical message that food fortification remains one of the most effective tools we have to ensure widespread access to essential vitamins and minerals, particularly in contexts where nutritious diets are out of reach for many. Your overview of the current status of compliance across West Africa was both eye-opening and motivating. It's clear that while progress has been made, there's still important work to be done, especially when it comes to consistency and enforcement. Your emphasis on the private sector as a key player in this ecosystem was duly noted, and the example of the micronutrient fortification index offers a powerful case study of how commitment and accountability can be cultivated across the value chain. Thank you again, Sean and Francis, for sharing a clear-eyed assessment and a hopeful vision for moving forward. So with that, we now open the floor for questions. And I don't know if the chat method allows it for discussions. We have about 45 minutes to deep dive into the insights shared by Sean and Francis. So please feel free to post your questions. And yes, I encourage us to make the most of this opportunity to engage directly with our keynote speakers and explore how we can turn their ideas into collective action. So with that, I will pass the mic to Rike, who was observing the chat for us. Rike, please share impressions or questions from the participants with us. Thank you.
Thank you, Kristina, and thank you to the speakers for your inspiring words. We received a few questions in the Q&A and in the chat. And again, as Kristina also has said, if you have any questions, please feel free also to post your questions there. I tried to summarize a few that we received so far. So there was a question regarding the importance of fortified foods in crisis situations, and also weighing importing fortified foods versus the production on the locally. And Sean has already replied to some extent to this question, but I want to open this a bit up to the importance of fortified foods in crisis situations, and then also maybe, Sean, if you could shed a bit more light on where fortified foods actually originate from.
Yeah, thanks so much for that. And perhaps fortification can solve a lot of issues, but we've also learned during the last hour that it does not solve connectivity issues. I myself was out, so Francis, I missed part of your presentation, but fortunately I'd seen your slides beforehand. But I think it's a really important question, and I'll start with an anecdote, but I think in a real life experience. During the crisis in Cote d'Ivoire, where the country was effectively split in half, one of the few things, nutrition interventions to get into the north of the country, was fortified foods. So I would argue in crisis situations, fortification remains incredibly relevant, because foods almost always continue to travel and people continue to have to purchase food. So it has its relevance, and certainly also in crisis situations. And I believe there are people here from organizations that work very much in crisis response. It's even more important to make sure that any of the food that's being delivered in crisis situations is fortified, because those families are more at risk than ever. But then also, I think there is perhaps this, I would say, usually a myth that somehow fortified foods are all imported, whereas the vast majority of foods that are fortified are produced by national or regional companies, the flour millers, the salt refiners, the cooking oil producers. And I think now often the fortification premix is imported, but I think the face of the private sector that's fortifying foods is usual national enterprises. And I have found that personally very revealing, and also means that these are companies that are part of the social fabric of the countries where they work and have a deep commitment beyond the bottom line in terms of financial revenue, have a deep commitment to doing good to the populations they serve. I was in, as an example, I was in Kenya late in December of last year and was invited to the Cereal Millers Association gala dinner. And the way these millers spoke about nourishing Kenya and how deeply committed, this was not coming from an intellectual point of view, although they're highly intellectual, it was coming very much from the heart, that they feel so proud of their ability to deliver fortified foods to over 40 million Kenyans a day. There's a real sense of pride and ownership. The other point I want to make is I think one of the big weaknesses, and I believe is that often the foods that are, for example, cooking oil, local producers in general are trying to stand up and do the right thing, but you still have big leakage of imported foods not meeting standards. And it's so essential that we're working on both sides for a public health impact, but also if you're a local producer and you're being undercut by imported foods that are not meeting the fortification standard, it really is so discouraging, you might not be able to keep up. So those are a couple of elements of response. But the last thing, fortification can do a lot, but none of us should think that fortification resolves all the nutrition issues. It's something we can do well, and it has a huge impact, but there are other things that have to happen to solve the nutrition challenges we're facing.
Thank you, Sean. You raised also the important question of compliance of fortification in local production. This was also a question in the chat. So this is something that I want to also give to you and to Francis to answer. There was a question, how can we build capacity of regulatory bodies to monitor compliance, and how can we coordinate them better? And also collect data. I mean, Francis also spoke about this in his presentation.
Yeah, and if Francis is online, I'd like to put him on the spot first, because he actually is much more of a food technologist than I am. But I realize he has a connectivity problem.
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Oh, okay. Yes, well, I just know little of food science. Like the case, we didn't have much project in Africa. I mean, strengthening African processors of fortified foods (SAF) program, which was implemented between 2016 and 2022, actually emphasized capacity building in what they were able to assist the private sector or the industry that are into the business of fortified foods. And in the process, I think more of making them more competitive, because in terms of what they do, that such in terms of trade, because the essence of fortifying to a private sector is to earn more money, because you have added value to your product. So you want to see it being competitive. And I think they are able to do that, and they are able to provide technical assistance for them. In terms of how on their own, I showed a chart where you have self-assessment. On their own, they have some key questions they have to answer. They assess themselves. Most often, people who don't know us are the ones who assess us, but they assess themselves to know whether they're really performing well or not. And from time to time, when they do that, virtually every year, it turns out that it's encouraging them to do more. And that has really built trust and accountability of that industry in the process of food fortification. So I think that's just one way to providing responsive technical assistance for them, and then engaging with other stakeholders to really body in Nigeria, for instance, and in Kenya, just not doing all. Recall the kind of regulatory monitoring we have been doing is to go from time routinely to go and collect information about those data. We are talking about compliance data. But now the industries are doing those things themselves. Then you are giving the regulator the opportunity to monitor other things, as well as just looking for cases that are outliers from whatever data the industries are providing. And I think that's how we do that. So we need to really engage ourselves effectively. We need to motivate the private sector so as to improve the fortification compliance. And then I just want to add too that in terms of just like what Sean said, virtually in all countries, in fact, the story of in Kenya, I think it's in Kenya, the first fortification industry that had to take it up by itself to actually fortify. You know, its own case, I think it's a case study we need to still bring out and showcase to other countries to really see how private sector, I've forgotten the name of the private sector at this moment, but they came up, they started the whole process themselves, just like the same way HKI, GAIN, NI, and the rest, or CRS, will go and then help government, help others. But they help themselves by contacting the regulator, contacting government, and all those things, and the kind of guidelines they need to do, and they did it themselves. So I think it's really feasible if we encourage them the more. Thank you.
And if I may, Rika, just to build on Francis's, I think one should look at compliance absolutely not as a policing function. And the first actors in ensuring compliance are the food industries themselves. And if you look at, and here I'm pretending to be a food technologist, which I'm not, I've just had the good fortune of cohabiting and building and learning from food technologists such as Maoli, who's on the call. And, you know, the first line to ensure, first and most important line to ensure compliance are the industries themselves. And most of these industries already have quality control mechanisms in place. They all do, because they're deeply concerned about the quality of their product. And so it's building that into their standing operating procedures. And then that the government regulators are working hand in hand, partners like us are working hand in hand with them to make their systems work even better. I do think, again, that the weakest link in the chain of compliance is often the imports, where there's far less control on foods that are foods that are imported. And that really breaks down, I think, trust in the system. But it's like any intervention, and I think others have spoken to this earlier in the day, of it's absolutely essential to have standards that are set by government with a public health impact in mind. But if standards, if they do not lead to performance that's required, then they're not having any impact. So I would argue compliance is everything. And that's why when I laid out my buckets of opportunity gaps, compliance is the absolute first, because there's no reason to, if you're not getting compliance with current standards, redesigning your program is not going to change anything, or bringing in a new fortification vehicle or new fortificants into an existing vehicle is not going to change anything. So to me, that performance working hand in hand between the private sector, the public sector, and partners is the most critical aspect of this. Otherwise, there is no impact.
Thank you both for answering this question. Apart from compliance, what would you say are other regional priorities or priorities on regional level to address? And I'd like to connect this with another question. What are current activities by also development partners to support these priorities on regional level?
I'd also be happy to give the floor to Francis first, although I'm...
Yeah, happy to have Francis first to respond, if that's possible with the connection.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think what Sean has said could be connected to that regional harmonization, because he said importation to some countries and exportation we are making in an attempt to make more money for trade purpose could lead to really compromising the standard we are talking in another client. So if we then have regional harmonization of this standard, then you know where you are pushing your product is going to be the same standard from where you are coming from, not necessarily your own standard to another standard to dilute the standard that they have there. I think that's really a major kind of issue that we need to look at. And then again, I think in the quality control and assurance, yes, we normally talk of testing and all those things, but there's no way someone can show in the record of what they do, which we always emphasize along that value chain when it comes to quality control and assurance. But we always take it separately, record keeping, data keeping, in such a way that can really be looked into and then decide, and at every point take action by all stakeholders from time to time. I think that's very, very important. And that's what is bringing us into actually getting the quality control and assurance in a kind of digitalized system that everything can flow, and then we all have that. So we need to be more transparent when it comes to that. The private sector, I know for business competition, is always very difficult to share data among themselves, but data for fortification, I think we need to find a way around that as well. Thank you. Over.
Yeah, and then if I can build on, thank you, Francis. So I really see 5 essential roles or areas where the regional can be incredibly helpful. And of course, to me, the most fundamental is the one that Francis started with, which is harmonization of standards. I think most of the, food is traded. Borders in West Africa are particularly artificial. And I think, again, I'm not actually a miller nor a cooking oil producer, but I've had the good fortune of learning from those who are. And it's extremely difficult if you're sitting in the Benin Republic and producing both for your market as well as the market in Nigeria and a market in other neighboring countries, to have different fortification levels all over. And so it's an opportunity to join a regional trade agenda with a regional public health agenda. So the standard harmonization, I think, is incredibly important. I also, going back to what's been stated, there is such enormous learning and experience in this region, but there's not necessarily a mechanism. How do we continue to pass the torch onward so that collective knowledge doesn't wither on the vine when people like Francis and I go to another calling, right? And so keeping that incredible learning collected, curated, and available so that we're not relearning as new people come into this field, I think is incredibly important. There's also, and this may be a challenge, I do think that I find it totally unacceptable that for a public health program, most countries are continuing to charge import duties and value-added tax on imported fortification premix and materials. And I do think that there's a role for the regional bodies to say, look, this is so important. The industry itself is already carrying, 90% of the burden of recurrent costs. We shouldn't be making them pay on top of that when they're doing a public health good. And I think there's a way to have a regional movement to provide duty-free import of fortification and equipment, fortification premix and equipment for those food for fortification that's done for a public health outcome. There's also another aspect that one of the quality issues that perhaps gotten a bit less airtime here is that an industry can be doing the right thing, buying premix and putting it at the right levels, but if the premix itself is not a good quality, the whole system fails. And I think a regional body can really help do pre-qualification of premix suppliers to make sure a regional harmonization of premix standards and more quality assurance so that particularly some of these industries, I mean, industries are of highly variable size. Not every industry is going, every industry has some internal quality assurance mechanisms, but not everyone has the ability to do independent validation of the quality of the premix. And that's a huge burden, right? So doing something to ensure quality and potentially, and I think the Director General of the West African Health Organization referred to this, is there a way to, obviously anytime bringing prices down is the more you can have a collective demand and grouping purchases for premix could help drive down the prices significantly. And then finally, these industries almost all work on very low margins and always need access to capital. And sometimes that's not easy to have, not just for fortification, but for everything they do. And there are regional development banks. There may be mechanisms of the region where the regional body could help industries, that you're creating a financial carrot, not to subsidize fortification, but to say, look, if you perform well on fortification, you get easier access to some of these financing facilities. So those are a few ideas at the regional level that I think some we're already doing, and I think where we can continue to build the power of the regional movement.
Thank you both for your detailed responses. I mean, since there's a lot to be done and stakeholders need to be convinced, there are questions also related to advocacy for fortification. There was a question on when we talk about large-scale food fortification as cost-effective, what are the metrics or factors that determine this? And then there's also a question regarding, let's say, myths regarding fortified foods. How do we respond to critics who say that virtually all fortificants used for these fortification programs are of synthetic origin and thus pose some threat to human health in the long term? So this is not the only kind of myth attached to fortified foods, but how do we improve our communication? And yeah, in terms of the cost effectiveness of fortification, how do we respond to this as well? Francis or Sean, whoever wants to respond first.
Let me, if I may, and Francis, please just jump in. I realize you're having connectivity issues. I guess where, to me, fortification is also an equity issue. So I'm addressing the myth because, I come from the US. In North America, there are almost no risks of micronutrient malnutrition because, in fact, we've been fortifying foods for 100 years. And in the global North in general, large-scale food fortification has been the standard for starting with salt ionization for 100 years. And I just don't think that something that has proven both its effectiveness in reducing burdens of micronutrient malnutrition, its cost effectiveness, and its safety for so long, how can we possibly ethically deprive populations in West Africa from this solution? I do think perhaps sometimes it can be misconstrued that we're saying fortification will solve all nutritional problems. None of us are saying this. We're saying there's a specific problem with a specific solution that can go to scale, and where, in fact, the bulk of the resources to do it, to cover the recurrent costs, are coming to the private sector, so the public sector can go and focus the very scarce public health resources on other aspects of nutrition that cannot be solved with just private sector resources. In terms of cost effectiveness, I think the literature on this is huge. I think, Francis, you had some very important data points in your presentation. Because it's at such large scale and the incremental cost of adding the fortificant to foods is so low, it does have an incredible level, a high level of return on investment, one of the best in probably all of global development. So I think that evidence is really strong. And then to the most important one of advocacy, this is where I think we need to continue to push the envelope. I certainly have seen this, and for example, one of the first speakers, I think captains of industry themselves can be important advocates. And I go back to the very nature of these industries. Most of them have deep roots in these countries. I go back to, AIFO-CEDEAO has become such a champion of large-scale food fortification, not to promote self-interest, but to say this is something we producers living and working in West Africa can do for the health of the populations we serve. The Kenya Millers Association is another example. I think also looking at civil society organizations, there's a woman in Ethiopia, Beza Haley Shah, who in fact lost a child to neural tube defects, a person who has incomparable credibility, and she has created her own civil society organization to advocate for food fortification. I mean, when you hear her speak, you will burst into tears, and it moves us from these cold numbers to real heart-wrenching life experiences that are absolutely preventable. So I think the more we can elevate the voices of people who have a direct interest in large-scale food fortification, the better it is. But I think it's an area where we need to continue to explore of what are the structures who can be really strong advocates to turn this from I mean, it obviously has a technological aspect, but at the end of the day, we're all human beings and doing this for a very human reason. And how can we give that human voice to the work we do every day?
Yeah, maybe if I may just add to what Sean has said. I think I have just two things. One of them is, the way we present fortification, food fortification, which we know is just a strategy out of other strategy. I mean, we have to actually ensure reduction in micronutrient deficiency. We will have supplementation, and we have that. Even amidst, in the community of nutritionists, they have that argument as well, that, oh, when you fortify, you are already increasing the dosage of vitamins and minerals, which is not true. And I think that's the kind of narrative too we need to push, that is only contributing. But when we make fortification as if it does everything, then, and we're still pushing other things, it's like, that's the way people will always perceive that. But we have to take everything together, because
Francis, I'm going to take advantage.
And then
go ahead.
others. Oh, okay. So then the other thing is, I think we have to, like I said earlier on, the industries who are doing this all along, a particular industry set up its own industry without knowing WHO, without knowing HKI, without knowing anybody, and then it's producing its flour. Then HKI came in. So, but when I read a lot of documents, all you see is that, oh, HKI has been doing fortification, as if it's HKI doing that. Or CRS has been doing fortification for years. These are the people you hardly will hear the industry. And many of the industries, they were even like kind of advocate for us to jumpstart. Like in Nigeria, I know, I'm not biased, I know how Alhaji Aliko Dangote himself is convinced, and then he took it up. And he became a kind of early rise to fortify his own product, So I think we have to begin to push who is actually doing it. I start asking myself that question: who is doing fortification? Is it the person that's bringing the money to add premix, or the person that is actually doing it and have decided to add value to his product? So I think we really have to address those things and put them in a proper perspective, so that people will know this is what is happening. I know we need to advocate for more of the legislation, advocate for that, but let's know. And then the community too will know if it's not working or it's a problem, they know who they actually.
Yeah, addressing also this question, who is doing the fortification, or who are the actors involved? There are few questions in the chat related to this. So is there, how can we also involve the community level in fortification? Then there was a question, what is the role of the laboratories of control and how can we strengthen them? And how do the regional fortification alliance and the national alliances work together to ensure data sharing in the region?
Those are very insightful questions. I actually wanted to, as Francis was talking, as I had more time to reflect, I also wanted to address another myth that often occurs in food fortification. I mean, rightfully, there's a concern about increasing consumption of ultra-processed foods, and sometimes there's this idea that fortifying staples or condiments is increasing their consumption. But fortification is somewhat different than almost anything else you do in nutrition, because what you're doing is looking at what populations already consume, at what levels they're consuming, and bringing the nutrients into that. You're not driving behavior change, you're not promoting, and in fact, these are not really foods, these are ingredients that go into foods. And with 100 years of experience with fortification with salt of iodine, there's no evidence that anybody I know has been able to find that iodization of salt has increased salt consumption. Has there been increased salt consumption? Of course, but that's coming from other drivers. I think Central America has probably 5 decades of experience of fortifying sugar. People are not consuming, with vitamin A, people are not consuming more sugar because of the fortification. So I think there's this idea that somehow by fortifying, but I also say that's why it's so important that fortification not be a marketing tool, but really the government working in collaboration is setting it for what are the public health needs and what standards, and you make it mandatory. Then I'll respond to some of the questions that you raised, Raika, and I can't respond to all of them because I think they're very much a work in progress. But building on one, and I think this is where all of us around the table who are not actually food processors have to be really humble and modest and recognize the industry fortifies. None of us out there are processing food and actually fortifying food. Each of us has a role to play. The public sector certainly to set the standards, looking at the data, looking at the public health needs and how do you set the right standards. We as development partners supporting both the public sector and the private sector, donors to provide that incremental funding to be catalytic. But at the end of the day, fortification is done by the industry, and the bulk of these industries, the vast majority, in fact, are national and regional players. And in my experience, incredibly committed to this agenda once their leadership understands it. Then there's also, I think, a very important point that was raised in the questions of the role of laboratories. And I do think, and I probably should have said this, I do think it can be an incredibly important role at the regional level because it's difficult for every country to have the laboratories necessary just to maintain the quality and the throughput. And certainly industries themselves are doing a lot of quality assurance, but you do need to have that third-party validation. And I think understanding which are the strategic laboratories in the region and how do you support them to make sure they have what's needed so that the samples can be validated. I think the other questions I'm blanking on what they were. Sorry. So you can put Francis on the spot to respond to more. But I think some of them were still a work in progress. And I think this is what's so exciting that we've made so much progress in West Africa. We've learned so much. How do we continue to push the learning agenda here also to share across the region, but across the continent, across the world?
Thank you, Sean.
Oh, I think one was the data sharing. Yes, let's put that in Francis's lap because I think that's actually one of a big challenge. Francis, do you have thoughts on that one?
Yeah, kind of. I think with data sharing, I think that's the essence of the regional kind of harmonization of standards, and then we have to really harmonize how these are being conducted. However, I know the global fortification data exchange is one of those pieces that really collects data from countries because the regulatory bodies still conduct, carry out a kind of audit and qualitative data assessment, but that are kept and used within the country. I think we have just to create a kind of a platform for ourselves to be able to tap from what the countries are really saying, and then monitoring that as early within the region. You know, I recall when I checked the global there are not so much data from contact, maybe to access it may be an issue. And I think the development partners that are here can really look at that and then find a way further, maybe to digitalize that, you know, in terms of how we collate those data and then use them for regional purpose. Yeah, I think that's the idea I just have now. Over.
Thank you, Francis. There's since you're speaking, there was a specific question regarding the tool, the MFI, Micronutrient Fortification Index, and whether there are results on its use in Nigeria. How the tool is working in Nigeria, and what are the results obtained, and how do you document it? I guess also how you advertise for its use.
Yes, it's really working in Nigeria, Kenya, and Tanzania. However, I think it's a little bit transformed now to have Miller's, I think, Alliance for Nutrition. You know, Millers have gathered together to take that up, then make it globally and exchange the experience amongst themselves. That's what they do now. But as for Nigeria, which I know quite well, I realize that, yes, the industries still continue now to date. They now have a system within their quality control and assurance department to make sure they collect all the information. So there are areas of questions that are asked, and in terms of what they have achieved. But we go beyond to now have the independent group to assess and validate this independently. And then even the product within that period of time. That's what I'm saying. With that, I think there are a lot of data that are being gathered in Nigeria currently now. TechnoServe, if they are here, they know that's their work. And then doing in Kenya and in Tanzania and in some other parts. I wouldn't know where they are now, but I think that's what is happening. And it has always been a source of encouragement for the industries to really participate. So it's, compliance, level of compliance has actually increased, you know, tremendously over this period of time that they've started that program to date.
Thank you for the summary. There were two questions. I mean, we're focusing in this event on large-scale food fortification in the West African region, and Sean and Francis, you both highlighted also the progress that was made in the region. There were questions, what is the current level of activity, and that there's also need in other, or demand in other regions, for example, in Central Africa for fortification. Do you have an estimate on, where West Africa stands in comparison to other regions, and whether there maybe is also an exchange? Right.
So I'll start with a perspective, and given my background, I'm not always perceived as objective comparing West Africa to other regions. But I would argue from a regional perspective in Africa, West Africa is probably most advanced, because early on in this journey, there was commitment to work both at the national level and the regional level. And I think there's a huge capital of experience of the value added of that interface. Other regions in Africa have had some regional progress, but I don't think it's been as structured and methodical as it has been in West Africa. I would agree. The Central Africa is, other than Cameroon, where there's been progress in general, there's just not been the progress. So I do think that there are certainly lessons learned of what are some of the success factors of the West Africa. I think certainly one of the success factors is that there is the combination of a commission, the Economic Community of West Africa States, that has a dedicated health organization, the West African Health Organization. So you had this interface of ministers of health in the region being very strong advocates for fortification, with an economic commission that it reports to that also has a regional trade agenda. So it's this sort of magic of public health and regional trade coming together. And then also, I would be remiss if I didn't call out the historical, very strong leadership of the UMOA Commission, which covers the countries in West Africa that use the CFA franc. That was an early leader of providing that regional leadership on large-scale food fortification. So I think those are some of the secret ingredients that have really brought together the national level and the regional level. And of course, historically, just the level of exchange and trade across the region that I think most of the producers also have sort of a regional mentality already, because of course you sell across borders. Food does not know borders in West Africa. If you would, Reich, I saw there was another question in the chat in French that was saying sort of what are some of the preconditions for large-scale food fortification? And I think that's so important, because large-scale food fortification, I think too often, I think unfortunately too often in nutrition, we're pitting ourselves, oh, this intervention is better than this intervention. In fact, we need multiple interventions, and large-scale food fortification is not at all in competition with other programs such as good counseling for improving diets, not at all. And it does have some unique characteristics as a nutrition intervention. And I say, starting, you need to critically identify the food vehicles you're choosing. They have to be consumed, widely consumed, either staples or condiments, by populations at risk of micronutrient malnutrition. They also have to be reasonably centrally processed. And I think saltitization has proven the importance of that the progress has been made. When you have a host of artisanal producers, it's very hard to go to scale. There can't be any changes perceptible to the consumer. So any changes in taste, color, perception, so any organoleptic changes, it just doesn't work, because we're not looking for behavior change. We're looking to bring the nutrients to what people are already eating. And it has to be feasible, both from a cost perspective, because again, and a technological perspective, because the companies that produce these foods are these foods in general. This is a sector where they're very, very low margins. So if you're going to have, okay, it's going to cost the double of the price of the food, it's just not economically feasible for the industry to do it. So it has to be feasible. So I think those are some of the preconditions to make large-scale food fortification work. And I go back to, I think that's the third factor of success, I think, in West Africa, is early on systematically looking through these food fortification rapid assessment tool surveys of, well, what's actually working, looking at the industry landscape of what's actually being produced that could be fortified, cross-checking that with what populations are eating. And so really selecting what vehicles to run with, and really focusing initially on the 3 vehicles: salt, cooking oil, and wheat flour, and then continuing now to expand the vehicle mix based on potential vehicles that actually meet those criteria. And I think that's so important. But I would stress again that one shouldn't see as large, oh, do I do large scale food fortification, or do I do counseling to moms about how to best nourish themselves and their children? These are two, this is not in competition, and both have an incredible added value. I do think one of the, I would go back to one of the huge comparative advantages of large-scale food fortification is that at the end of the day, while there have to be some continued public sector investments, the vast majority of the recurrent costs are covered by the private sector. So it means that the public sector, which has always scarce resources, can hone in on providing that support to the parts of nutrition that absolutely need that public sector support.
Yeah, thank you so much for outlining the history in West Africa and then the strong points as well and the successes that were achieved. Francis, do you want to also add on to this? If the connection allows. Maybe, looks like we lost you, unfortunately. There are a few specific questions in the chat that maybe can be also be answered in writing, and some comments regarding a need for a dashboard, also for standard assessment guidelines from the from a UMOR association, which was set up and needs additional support. But there was maybe a broader question regarding the status of rice fortification in Africa, and perhaps we can make this the last question and then close early today for this session. Sean, can you say that? Yeah, unfortunately. Yeah.
So I also saw a question on the practice that's called biofortification,
Yes.
which is I think important. So if I may speak to that, and then I will opine about rice fortification, but there may be others who have differing opinions. So there was a question about, is there work being done to do selective breeding to increase the nutrient content of staples? Indeed, there is. That's a practice called biofortification, which sometimes is, I think, a term that perhaps mystifies it more. But basically, it's saying, I think historically, when you've looked at plant breeding, again, I'm speaking as if I actually know what I'm talking about. I'm not an agronomist. I've had the good fortune of living with agronomists, and I've learned, as I try to absorb a lot. But, you know, basically, historically, when you look at crop breeding, it's really focused on yields. And it's more or less not been sort of agnostic about nutrient content. So the whole idea of breeding for better nutrition is, okay, if we're breeding varieties, because you constantly are improving varieties, it's the basis of agriculture. Well, instead of just breeding for improved yield of sweet potatoes, can I breed for improved yield of sweet potatoes and increase vitamin A content? And in fact, you can. And so there are a whole host now of what are called biofortified crops that have been bred to improve the nutrient content. There are biofortified varieties of beans, of sweet potato, of maize, of cassava, etc. But I don't see this again as in conflict whatsoever of large-scale food fortification. I think they're incredibly complementary. What we have seen in the breeding plants for better nutrition is that the uptake to really get to that saturation point, that you're not just having a few orange flesh sweet potatoes grown here, but you're really saturating the sweet potato value chain with biofortified varieties. That uptake has taken a long time. So again, that's why I think the large-scale food fortification is so important, because it also can go to scale much more quickly than some of our other solutions. Not at all in competition with continuing the breeding agenda, so that as we look for breeding, we're looking at yields, climate resilience, and nutrient quality, I think is incredibly important. And then the other question, Rika, now that I opined on that one, I forgot what it was. Could you remind me? On
The other question was rice fortification.
Oh, rice fortification, right. And that's why I go, I think I go back to sort of some of the key characteristics of a good fortification vehicle. Of obviously rice throughout West Africa meets the first one, that it's commonly consumed everywhere. Where it starts to be more questionable, and there's a lot of work to see if this can be solved, because obviously it's very attractive of the potential and how much it's present in diets across West Africa. Is it centrally processed enough? So there are efforts to see, can rice fortification work? I think across the globe, and technologically, there's a good technology that it is somewhat more costly. And so technologically, from a technological perspective and a cost perspective, it is at the higher end of fortification. If you look at the cost of fortification, rice fortification is at the higher end. At the same time, it can contain, rice fortification can deliver several nutrients at a time, not just one. So it's very intriguing. I think if you look across the globe where rice fortification has certainly worked, it's when it's really connected to a social protection program, where, for example, in India, there's actually delivery of rice. So you've got a way to make sure that the rice is fortified. You've got a sort of a captive market, if you will. That also could be in humanitarian settings. Personally, and not everyone on this call will share this point of view, I'm skeptical that your typical pathway of scale for rice that we've had for fortification is going to work for rice, but it can play a very important role in social protection programs. But it's one of those things we need to continue to test and to learn, because there may be more and more consolidation of the rice market that makes it a feasible vehicle, not just in these social protection humanitarian settings, but also in a broader setting. But again, I think this is where we need to continue to learn, and where our regional platform is so interesting, that you continue to learn this and you pressure test it, because at the end of the day, we're committed to eliminating micronutrient malnutrition, and we really want to make sure we are pressure testing, making sure it's work, and adjust strategies as needed.
Yeah, very good point. I think this is also what brings us together here in this event today and tomorrow, the mutual learning. Francis, are you back and would like to also address some of the points that were raised?
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah. I think, let me start from the last statement by Sean concerning the issue of rice fortification and the rest. And I think what is really happening still calls for all of us going back to, you see, we have to continually appraising fortification program. It's becoming more and more dynamic in terms of what it's delivering. If you check what is actually affecting the coverage of fortified food, is because of the cost of living is now pushing many of the consumers to go directly for those that are not fortified, because the ones that are fortified are like premium to them. So even wheat flour and all the rest, you now see household handling wheat flour from the start rather than buying the one that is already fortified. So that has actually reduced the impact that fortified wheat flour will have to, provide. So there's really a need to appraise that. The same thing with rice. If you fortify rice, process their rice, and saying we really need to sit back again and look at, especially when we look at those we are importing that are not fortified. They are there. They are competing with those ones that are already centrally fortified. And then there are some from home to home, they are not fortified, yet they are competing with those that are fortified in the market space, in our local market. I think we really need to look at that. And then just to add to what he said about compliance issues in the Central Africa, yeah, if you look at that, even with flour that we are celebrating in West Africa, I think West Africa, apart from the East Africa, is actually doing wonderfully well, coming, close by, and I mean, could be attributed to what Sean said. So West Africa is very much. If you look at Central Africa, not much is going on. Many of them are yet to make some of those legislation mandated or mandatory rather for their country. So they're still doing all those things. I think we have a lot of learnings to really make, because eventually, so there won't be a kind of an epidemic, because if they have products that are not fortified, invariably too, they will be talking to us in West African as neighbors, as friends, as the same people, to want to trade with those same products. And there are those that will always bring about a kind of dilution to the effort we have made over the years. So I think about that, to make sure we others across the continent. Yeah, thank you. Over.
Thank you so much, Francis and Sean, for answering these questions. Thank you, everyone, also for posing your questions in the chat and in the Q&A box. There was a short discussion also about testing the quality of fortificants, but there was also a comment by someone in the chat that this will also be discussed in another session. So I think at this point I also say thank you from my side and hand it back to Kristina.
Thank you, Rike, for being the voice of those who wrote in the chat. Thank you to everyone for your thoughtful questions and active participation. And of course, a heartfelt thank you once again to our keynote speakers, Sean Baker and Francis Amino, for your time, your insights, and your leadership as well. I think this morning's discussion has reminded us that while the challenges of LSFF in West Africa are real, so are the opportunities. And the exchange we just had is a step forward in the direction of progress. As we move into the next sessions, let's carry forward the key messages we've heard. Thank you all for being part of this conversation. Let's stay engaged, inspired, and focus on action. We look forward to the sessions ahead. So we are